Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies. Produced under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative of the International Studies Association and made available through ISA's Professional Resource Center. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with a thoughtful and engaged teacher of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by sorting through the complexities of what binds us to our collective identities as teachers, to articulate nuances of what we do, too often without thinking about it too much, so that we can all learn from each other how we might do it better. By attending to what makes us comfortable, doing the same kinds of things that make many people supremely uncomfortable, we acknowledge our skills and our craft, even as we help make it more accessible to others. Today's conversation is with Dr. Mauro Caraccioli, Associate Professor of Political Science and a core faculty member of the Alliance for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Thought aspect at Virginia Tech University in the United States. Mauro teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the history of political thought, political domination, religion and narrative, phenomenology, historiography, and other courses related to empire and coloniality. Our conversation explores how institutional context influence student attitudes and, by extension, how we as instructors empathize with them, differences between the pedagogical approaches to undergraduate and graduate students, and ways to help doctoral students prepare for their role as teaching academics. Dr. Mauro Caraccioli, thank you for being part of the podcast and welcome to The Teaching Curve.
Dr. Jamie Free, I'm delighted to be here.
So, one of the things that we always start off with is by having the interviewee tell us a little bit about where they are by describing the people that make us all teachers, and that's our students. So tell us a bit about who you teach and their characteristics.
All right, excellent. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I am an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech. We are a large land grant, rural Southwest Virginia style comprehensive research university that sees about 30,000 plus students enrolled in our classes every year. In terms of demographic specifics, though, Virginia Tech benefits from two things to our recruitment of our undergraduate student body. On the one hand, we benefit from a sort of legacy component. Virginia Tech's been around for a long time and has been incredibly successful in placing students and giving students an educational experience that keeps, them sending their own kids back, if you will. Yep. And the overwhelming majority of our students come from the Northern Virginia area. Right. So these are folks who, as undergraduates, may have come here, but went back to have successful careers either in the Richmond area or more specifically in the Northern Virginia area around the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Over 90% of our students come from this area. And I think that's an important demographic factor to realize because Southwest Virginia demographically is very different from Northern Virginia. And as a land grant, we often have very, very tense conversations here about whether we are actually serving the populations that we should be serving, namely the populations here of Montgomery County and the surrounding kind of rural counties of Southwest Virginia. So I'm not just faculty in the political science department. I teach in a boutique signature interdisciplinary graduate program with the acronym ASPECT, which stands for the Alliance for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Thought, a kind of shared PhD program between the departments of political science, history, philosophy, and the Department of Religion and Culture. We actually have a very different kind of experience with our graduate students. In general, our graduate student population in Virginia Tech comes from all over the world. We have students coming from not only all over the United States, but really across Europe and South Asia and Latin America, precisely for our signature graduate programs. And what do I mean by signature graduate programs? I specifically mean interdisciplinary programs in the College of Natural Resources, the College of Architecture, the College of Engineering, the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. So while we don't have a very evident, vibrant international student population among our undergraduates, we do have some international students. The graduate student population looks very different. And that includes the students that we attract to Aspect. We have quite a few students who are from abroad, and therefore that creates a sort of richer, or at least a slightly different in terms of richness conversation as to both the intellectual experiences that students have here, but also their expectations of what they want out of their graduate careers. We have many students across the university who don't necessarily intend to pursue careers here in the United States. They want to go back to their home countries and take that sort of graduate education to build lives over there. But we also have many students from the United States that pursue some of our graduate programs at the master's level. And so in my own department, I often teach courses for our MA in political science, where we have students who are looking for a certification to go do government-related work back in Northern Virginia, or who are looking for a stepping stone to a different kind of a PhD program, a more disciplinary PhD program that we might not be able to offer.
Tell me a little bit more about the classes that you're teaching to these international students. Well, to everybody, right? But it's in a context in which you're going to have to be dealing with students who are coming from different, diverse contexts.
Oh yeah. I like to tell the story that when I was a graduate student, I was incredibly, almost to a fault, undisciplined, right? I was very, very reluctant to pursue general run-of-the-mill courses in political science. I desperately wanted courses in other departments. It became difficult because so much of graduate education is fulfilling credit hours, as I know now in the roles that I play at here. And then when I was interviewed, when I applied, when I was interviewed, and when I got the offer to come here, I found that I was probably one of the more conventional members of the department, given that we have an incredibly eclectic faculty, meaning we don't just have traditional political scientists. We do have some, but we also have significant strengths in international studies and in cognate programs related to international studies in the areas of, say, national security and foreign affairs, European Union politics and European relations, as well as around different issues of American politics, not just American government, but also the presidency, race and inequity, and gender. And so I found myself not struggling to find what I would teach, but quite the contrary. I felt like, wow, I'm now in an opportunity where I don't have to teach a traditional political science course. So my experience here teaching at Virginia Tech has only increased my undisciplined nature, because I increasingly move towards less canonical textbook driven sort of ways of thinking about problems to really deal with the questions that are on students' minds. And I gave the example of a political theory course, but I follow very much the same approach when I teach international studies courses. I've taught a couple in the last few years here dealing with pandemic politics on the one hand, a timely topic, but also more familiar regional areas like Latin America, but teaching them through a different lens that speaks to what may students be curious about these parts of the world or these problems that we face. And I follow a very similar approach in my graduate teaching, where I think by definition, our graduate teaching here and at Virginia Tech, and Aspect specifically, has to be adaptive because we have a co-teaching mandate. Students are required to take courses that are co-taught by myself and other faculty. And very rarely do I teach a graduate seminar that is me solo. And when I do teach it in a solo fashion, it resembles that more of an eclectic nature that I use in my undergraduate teaching. But yeah, I think I've learned, I say this at the end of every semester, but in my teaching, I learn more from my students every semester than they possibly learn from me, because I don't follow the line that I have something concrete to give them. Rather, I follow the line that they give me their concerns, and I provide them with either a kind of kaleidoscope, or at the very least, a buffet option of, here are these possible ways that we can respond to these problems.
So yeah, because one of the things that's really interesting for me, I in my career, I've taught one class that had one graduate student in it. And that's my extent of experience with teaching and making that adjustment. So can you talk a little bit more about just the pedagogy of teaching undergraduates versus teaching a graduate seminar?
Yes, absolutely. I think the first thing to kind of sort of embrace is one of the pitfalls of being an educator is that you many times, and I'll speak for myself at least, you start becoming a teacher thinking that every student is like you were as a student, which is not in and of itself wrong. But if you are sort of the traditional academic that got gold stars all the time and never missed class and knew they wanted to be a professor from their sophomore year of college, then you increasingly find yourself on the wrong end of the classroom, so to speak, in that that's not the reality that most students want to pursue. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean they're bad students. It's just that you're not the typical student, right?
Well, and they're, of course, in their agency making choices about how to be a college student, where to put their energies and those kinds of things. So that's a totally reasonable but I understand what you're saying about your own mindset going in to deal with students who are not thinking the same way you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I started as a teacher, I had finished my master's coursework, and I was thrown into the classroom. This is sort of, again, benefiting me, but this was a classic problem of the perils of adjunctification, right? I taught as an adjunct for 3 semesters before I had even defended my master's degree. I was teaching basically people who were my peers, so to speak, because I was only 24 years old. But at the same time, I was teaching at a charter middle school where I was teaching 7th grade and 8th grade philosophy. And I mentioned those 2 examples because they're really important to how I navigated the different pedagogical opportunities, I'm going to say, between teaching middle school students and teaching college students, right? And in my worst moments, I would say things to my college age students like, my middle schoolers have an easier time dealing with these questions than you guys. But then I would catch myself and I would very much realize the realities of why is that? Because most of my college age students were working either day jobs or night jobs. I taught and I went to a commuter school where the majority of students didn't have the experience that I had. I worked in the library on campus. I was able to afford, nice things on the weekends because I lived at home. Many of my students at FIU were taking care of elders, were taking care of their own children. I taught night classes, and I've never, since my time at FIU, had a night class that had 50 people in it, because the realities of teaching at a university like Virginia Tech are very different than the realities of an urban kind of commuter campus. And the added layer of teaching at a middle school helped me think a lot about adjusting not just my expectations, but even my plan. What is it that I wanted to cover per class session and per class day? Yeah. And over the years, I've learned increasingly to let go as a strategy, a pedagogical strategy, which is not to say that I just walk in there and anything goes and I'll just sort of riff on whatever comes to mind that day, but to really take whatever plan for a course schedule and for assignments that I develop with a much more fluid disposition, and be willing to admit that, sometimes I'm going to have to get rid of assignments. Sometimes I'm going to have to adjust the expectations of the assignments. Sometimes I'm going to have to grant extensions. And that was true both of my middle school students, as well as my older students, as well as the sort of traditional 18 to 22-year-old students I've been teaching the last few years, particularly during the last 2 years of this pandemic. So my first, investments in pedagogy came very much from this idea that people bring their own realities to the classroom. And in my view, they're more important than the realities that I bring with me, which is not to say that I just let them take over, but I definitely do not follow a kind of authoritarian model where, as the sage on the stage, I bring the wisdom for you all to consume.
Well, it's a partnership.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a way in which the students are the ones constructing their learning in that context. And so there's a way that what you bring into that, they have to have access to, they have to be able to grab hold of and snap together like Legos or whatever it is,
Yeah, and more often it's less like Legos and it's more like putty, right? Sometimes, you're just dealing with the realities of people having, forgive my language, shitty days at work, or shitty days in the dorms. You're also dealing with the reality, again, especially in the last 2 years of, 18 to 22 can be a really wonderful, idyllic time of self-discovery. But it's also a time where many students, many of us discover mortality, right? The mortality of our families, of elders, of young people, if there's tragedies in your lives among your friends or family. And I don't think many of the college pedagogy courses that I've taken necessarily make space or room for that. And I use those two terms very deliberately. Making room in the acknowledgement that our students as young adults are also discovering what it is to live in a very, not indifferent world, but definitely a very challenging world. But also to make space for that in the classroom. I very much benefit from conversations at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of every semester with my students as to like, what's going on? What's helping you learn better this semester? What's really being a challenge to how we are discussing things this semester? Whether it's, I'll give you an example, Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts, or whether it's, a book on comic books in Latin America. The subject matter is not the important thing. The subject matter is merely a means to building that partnership and that bridge for those very, very quickly passing 14 to 16 weeks where, hey, we've got an opportunity to really learn something together. Asking the students, what do you want to learn, I think is an incredibly essential first step.
Do you think that graduate students are better at being able to answer that question?
Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a better answer.
Good.
In that graduate students, though not always, generally pursue graduate education as an extension of sort of intellectual curiosities. They were good at school. And so that was very much my story, right? Full disclosure. I thrived as an undergraduate and I had the right people kind of tell me like, you should pursue graduate school, right? Kind of like a Ponzi scheme, and it was a good Ponzi scheme for me, right?
Right.
But I remember being a kind of an obnoxious graduate student, right? And sort of this conception that, I've been anointed to pursue this wonderful lofty craft, and then thinking I had all of the answers, and increasingly over the years, learning not the hard way, but learning in a really, really generative way that this is a delightful, incredible opportunity to not just pursue learning and to have a very kind of bookish life, also to admit my own limitations, right? To admit the limitations of my position socioeconomic wise, to admit the limitations of my position intellectually, and increasingly, as we have over the last few years, the limitations that come from people's race and their sex and their gender, right? I benefit from white passing maleness in so many ways that as a graduate student, I learned how to shut up and listen, as opposed to sort of fill the room the entire time that I was talking. I consider that to be one of the most important lessons I got in graduate school, to sort of think about that. And I don't think that is as transparently presented to graduate students as much as it could be. So I have wonderful graduate students. None of them are obnoxious, I swear. But you do see sort of an enthusiasm that can be dangerous for them, because the moment they first hit that brick wall where things don't necessarily go their way, it does lead to sort of a moment of self-doubt to really consider, is this really the right thing for me? And mind you, there are different kinds of brick walls, right? Some are brick walls created by institutions that are really genuinely harmful. Others are brick walls that we create in front of ourselves. And that can be, if negotiated productively, can be opportunities for us to grow as people and as thinkers. But I feel like much graduate education is not that. Much graduate education resembles a kind of socialization that you and I are very familiar with, having gone to traditional graduate programs, where this is the canon. You learn the canon, and if you want to do well in your life and your career, you need to pursue the canon, and that's it. The rest is up to you.
Well, so that's really interesting, because in addition to just kind of to teaching in master's program, you're also teaching in the doctoral program, which presumably is producing people who are at least theoretically are considering becoming teachers like you and me. What do you think we should be teaching doctoral students about how to teach well? Is it the framework kind of thing? Is it the tactics? Is it both?
For the last 2 years, or at least, since the summer of the pandemic, I have served as the instruction and pedagogy coordinator for the Aspect students. So I basically am the person that advises them on the differences between pursuing a intensively teaching oriented PhD experience or a PhD experience that, to be transparent, puts teaching on a sort of a second tier in the service of their research goals. I think just clarifying that distinction for them is an incredibly important acknowledgement at the beginning of their time as a PhD student. It's part of my own pedagogy where I like to kind of tell them, it's like, well, what do you want out of your teaching experience? So the same way we should ask our students what they want to learn, we should ask our teacher, well, what do you want out of the experience? In addition to what do you want your students to get out of the experience? And I think I pause because I'm remembering that that book that is often recommended to graduate students that's titled Getting What You Came For. And I think that's a fine book. And I think those are really, really important conversations to have both with our graduate students and our undergraduate students. But I think one thing I think that instructors, teachers can and should do before having that question and that conversation with students of all kinds, though, is to acknowledge kind of the circumstances under which students are so-called getting what they came for. And I'll kind of develop that a little bit, right? I went to, it's no secret, I went to a Research One university, flagship university of the state of Florida, the University of Florida, where the mantra was very much that you're here to get a doctorate degree so that you can also work at a Research One university. Full stop. 7 years later, I did it. But through graduate school, my attitude was very much, I don't want to be part of an environment that is so hostile and often so dismissive about undergraduate education. And it wasn't because the faculty were nasty or mean to the students, but because the conditions under which they operated as faculty, right, the material conditions demanded that they prioritize research in a way that, at least for a young idealistic graduate student, translated into like, you don't really care about teaching. So my mantra was very much, I want to go to a liberal arts college. I want to go teach. So because teaching is the thing that's going to be rewarding. And sure enough, my first job, right, was at St. Michael's University, St. Michael's College in Vermont, where I was in a teaching intensive sort of environment. And I learned that, there are pitfalls and tricks to also, surviving in a teaching oriented kind of institution. And I ultimately ended up at what's called a so-called research university, Virginia Tech. But my approach has been very, very different than I think what I saw at the University of Florida, which was to not teach the realms of research and teaching as not just opposites, but even as enemies, and rather to kind of think about the relationship between those two things in a way that supports my goals as a teacher as well as my goals as a researcher, right? So that sometimes that meant giving up certain things. So if I have to teach the Plato to NATO class, maybe I can't make them read everything that I want to read, but I can organize it in a way where there are questions that are important to me that I can kind of develop in my own thinking while also introducing those questions to them. And that's fine as a teacher, but that goes back also to the issue of like, well, what do you tell a student, right? And I think getting what you came for also varies a lot for undergraduate students. I think the pressures of treating higher education as, I don't want to say merely, but as simply a means to employment, create just as much, if not more, a dissonant experience for our undergraduates as they do for faculty, right? Faculty like to complain that, students don't really care about learning, all they care is about getting for a job. Students see the same thing among faculty. Faculty don't really care about my learning, all they treat me as is a nuisance on their time, and they just throw assignments at me. And I say this not just from a one-off anecdote. I very much ask my students, and I think that I, give them the bare minimum of just asking them how their day or how their semester is going, and they're very happy to talk about how indifferent many faculty can be to their concerns and to their realities, right? So that's a long-winded way of kind of getting to this question, right? Of what is it that we want out of our educational environments? You can't answer that question in a singular way. Every institution is different, yes, but also every person asking that question brings normative assumptions about why they're there. And I don't think those are helpful in the short term. And in the long term, they're also not true, as many of us spend a career really rethinking our reasons why we stayed in academia or why we wanted to pursue in academia. Lucky are the people that never doubt why they wanted to come into this business and why they stay in this business. But for
I've yet to meet one, so let me know when you find one.
But for most of us, right? I don't want to say we're one bad lecture from getting out of the door, but for some people, those are real that right?
For sure.
Going back to that example of people drowning in grading or drowning in their teaching, it's like, well, what's going on that is everything that's going on outside of your control, going back to this theme of agency.
Right. And how does it fit in with your expectations? I think that's a good way of framing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mauro, thanks so much for having a conversation with me about this stuff. It's you and I can keep on talking for a very long time, but and I hope we do, because it's been enriching and it's always helpful for me to have these conversations, especially with people who are very thoughtful about jobs that are in many ways different from the ones that I've experienced. So hopefully that's what the rest of the audience is thinking as well. And I just want to say I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jamie. I love talking with you. And yes, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in the International Studies Association Professional Resource Center under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org, and you can follow us on Twitter @teachingcurve. Thank you for joining us again on the Teaching Curve. Remember to be on the lookout for all the ways that the International Studies Association is building pedagogy into their programming. And remember, learn something every time you teach.